Welcome to a celebration of Nantucket Sound, our monthly webinar series. I'm your host, Audra Parker. And for those of you who don't know our organization, we're the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound. And our mission is the long-term protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound, which is the body of water that lies between Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And this is really critical because Nantucket Sound represents the rare instance where you have state waters totally surrounding the federal waters in the center. The state waters of Nantucket Sound are part of a Massachusetts ocean sanctuary system and enjoy protection, while the federal waters in the center are unprotected. So, to address that situation, we have built a very strong coalition of stakeholders to promote a designation called a National Historic Landmark for the entirety of Nantucket Sound, to protect it as a single ecosystem, recognize its rich maritime and tribal history, and to ensure that traditional uses like recreation and fishing, continue to be protected while prohibiting any kind of inappropriate development. So just to give a couple of examples of National Historic Landmarks, the entire island of Nantucket is a National Historic Landmark, as is Wesleyan Grove on the Vineyard and the Kennedy Compound in Hyannisport. So it's the highest level of historic protection and recognition, and something that, Nantucket Sound clearly deserves. I mentioned we have a broad coalition of support, and that includes commercial fishing groups, municipalities across the Cape and Islands facing Nantucket Sound, historic preservation groups, environmental groups, and many, many others. So without further delay, I'm very happy to welcome our guest tonight, Mark Robinson, who is going to discuss land conservation on Cape Cod, as well as recent trends in eco-restoration and climate resilience, with a special focus on beachfront preservation along Nantucket Sound. A couple of words about Mark's impressive background. He's the executive director of the Compact of Cape Cod Conservation Trusts, and the Compact provides technical assistance to 36 local and regional land trusts on the Cape. He's a graduate of Williams College and the University of Rhode Island. He has served as the chairman of the Barnstable Conservation Commission, vice chair and treasurer of the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition, and vice president of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. Finally, I'm sure there's much more, but I don't want to take the entire hour with his bio. So Mark also serves on the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission and is a water commissioner for the Katuitt Fire District, where he serves as chairman. Wow. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you,
Excited to have
Audra.
you join us.
Happy to be here. This is a show that I've been giving around the Cape for the last couple of years, and this is the last time I'll present this. So I'm very happy to know that it's going to be archived in your website. And I will go through a lot of slides, some of them very quickly. There's a lot of data on some of the slides, and so if you're interested in the data, you can look at the slides later. I'm going to breeze through them, but it's an interesting story. And when you think about the history of Cape Cod, you can think about 4 million years of geologic history. You can think about 12,000 years of indigenous history. You can think about 400 years of colonial history. But land conservation really only goes back a little more than 100 years. And so I'm going to share my slides if I can find them here.
And I'm going to pop off, Mark, and then I will come
Okay.
back after your presentation to take questions from any questions we have from the audience. So I will
Okay.
see you in a bit. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. Yeah, I get this going here. Whoops. It's interesting. Here we go. So we're going to start with the idea that this is my history and my vision of the future of land conservation on the Cape. There is no definitive history. It's still being written every day. And this group of men here, and they are all men, is not the Osterville Men's Club. This is a bunch of senators and representatives working with President Kennedy to sign the Cape Cod National Seashore Act, the single biggest stroke of a pen to preserve open space on Cape Cod, but certainly not in and of itself the only thing that needed to be done. It was a start of the federal involvement in preserving open space, but the real story is related to the towns, the citizens, the nonprofit groups that have all worked together for many years to preserve open space. So we want to acknowledge the fact that the people of the First Lake, the Wampanoag tribe, has been on the Cape for more than 12,000 years. I'm sitting right now in Plymouth Town Hall because the Plymouth Select Board have just recognized the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe of Plymouth, having gotten their state recognition as a tribe just last year. And it's a very important day for them. So I'm going to start with a report done in 1892 for the brand new Trustees of Reservations, which was the first nonprofit land trust in the world, created by the Massachusetts legislature. And they hired a New Hampshire geography professor to walk around the coast of Massachusetts and report back on where could the public go to the shore to recreate. And he spent most of his time on the Cape and wrote most of his report about the Cape. And as you'll see here, he's basically sending out a signal from 1892 saying that the Cape is a beautiful place, but people are going to find it, and if you don't watch out, they're going to ruin it. It'll become like the city that they thought they were trying to leave. So you'll see this echo of cries of concern throughout the next century, and people responding to that anxiety about losing open space on the Cape. So what do we mean by protected open space? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that in order to preserve a lot of the resources, natural resources on the Cape, you're going to have to preserve the land that supports them. So if you want clean water, you have to support preserve the land that will clean the water adjoining it, whether it's groundwater, salt water, streams, ponds. They all have watersheds, and that watershed is the land that needs to be protected around them. Farms and good soils, we obviously need to preserve what little farms we have left on the Cape, and you'll see some examples of that later. Again, preserving open space is the way to do that. Wildlife habitat, obviously plants and animals need a place to thrive. And so to support that, you need to preserve the open space that they're running around in. We also have human attributes such as scenic views, our beautiful ponds and seashores, our open fields, our forests. People enjoy these beautiful landscapes. And that appreciation of their beauty has led to people feeling anxiety about losing those beautiful areas and leading to more preservation of open space. And also for public recreation, we want to preserve land so that we can link up hiking trails. And we saw during the COVID period, more and more people getting out and enjoying the trails so they could recreate in the outdoors and feel safe doing so. So those are the reasons why we want to protect open space. We'll deal with a little bit now on how that's been done. The first example of environmental protection was not to preserve open space. It was to preserve Provincetown Harbor. In 1714, town meeting passed a bylaw to say that people should not be cutting trees out in the dunes. Why? Because the wind was blowing the denuded dunes, the sand, into the harbor and creating shoaling problems for the fishing fleet. So this was the first time that the Cape took notice of the importance of preserving the environment. It was really more for economic development than it was for preserving the environment. And you have to recognize that this was all a wood-based economy at the time, as Thoreau mentioned when he went through the Cape and wrote his famous book. Basically, the Cape had been denuded, and by 1850, it looked like the bottom of the ocean laid bare. And this little print might be an exaggeration, but we've seen it certainly as time went on. The Cape was cleared from stem to stern, mostly for the building of houses, the wood needed for fencing, firewood, ships, all the different things that wood supported. And then it was also to clear the pastures for the sheep and the cattle to go out and graze. Into the 1900s, this denuded landscape persisted. It's only the forest that we see today is really only 100 years old, if that. Of course, we've still been cutting over the landscape for residential development, which was most rampant in my era during the 1980s, as we will see later some of the statistics on that. More recently, we've been clearing forests for ground-mounted solar arrays. And I'm a big supporter of solar power, but until we put solar panels on top of every parking lot on Cape Cod, we do not need to be cutting down our forests to accommodate them. And we're still building subdivisions. We're stripping the land, taking out every single tree so that we can bring in new landscaping materials uh, to support the new subdivisions. So back to Professor Harrison in 1892, he went through all the Cape towns, and this was the result that he found, that basically there were no public lands for people to recreate and enjoy nature on. Now remember, this was a very rural place back then. The Cape had been losing population after the Civil War up until about 1920 when it started to rebound. But because there was a little population, there was no real need to think about preserving open space because everybody just wandered where they wanted to. They all knew their neighbors and their fields to visit friends or go to the next town. But even things like town landings that were in the public domain, some of them were being sold off because the town was trying to generate revenue. So you can see here it was a real dearth of places where people could enjoy each other in a legal protected open space. The exception on the bottom there, you see Provincetown. There were 4,000 acres owned by the state, and that was called the Province Lands. And in 1893, perhaps as a result of this professor of geography's report, the state legislature created a boundary for the province lands and set it aside as a public reservation owned by the state. It was incorporated into the National Seashore in 1962. By 1895 and around the turn of the century, there were small village improvement societies. Here's one in Eastham, another one in Dennis, that created little pocket parks along Route 6A, which was the main drag for the north side. But before this time, there weren't village greens on the Cape. And I learned during this giving this presentation from a history professor that the reason was based on the Cape being part of the Plymouth colony. So if you were in Boston and in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and you wanted to create a new town outside of Boston, say like, oh, I don't know, Needham, you needed three things. You needed a minister, you needed a church, and you needed a town common. And if you visit a town like Needham, there's still a town common. But here on the Cape, Plymouth Colony wasn't so concerned about that, and there were no town commons at the time. This was a training field for the militia to march up and down with their muskets, and eventually it was preserved by the Improvement Society as the first public park on the north side of Dennis. So by the beginning of the 1900s, we realized that there were people who were conferring some of their noblesse oblige on their fellow citizens, such as Mr. Fay here in Falmouth. He had such a good feeling about the town that he wanted to give back. And this feeling of philanthropy, one-off philanthropy, giving back to the community that meant so much to them. He called it Goodwill Park because he felt the goodwill of the townspeople. And that has since been expanded. And the public water supply for Falmouth is now created out of some of that land. Here in Barnstable was the first example of somebody giving access to Cape Cod Bay. So remember, we had Sandy Neck 6 miles long, but there was no public legal access to it. You had to ask permission from Mr. Bodfish to go out and launch a dory into the bay, but he gave a couple acres. And if you go to the new Sandy Neck parking lot, you'll see that it's still called Bodfish Park. And that was the original 2 acres, which has been expanded now to almost 5,000 acres, but the foresight of the town government. People were preserving land, again, not for environmental attributes, but just because of the things that people could understand and appreciate, the beauty. So whether it was the beaches, the flowers, the birds, or in some cases, recreation, people were donating land to their communities, or in this case, to the state, Nickerson State Park, most popular state park in Massachusetts, as a campground. So it was, again, this idea of private philanthropy was driving open space protection. There was no money being expended by the towns or nonprofit groups to encourage that endeavor. So I said that the Cape started to redevelop after 1920 because mostly of the tourist economy. And this was the time when people could start to afford to buy cars. And that was important because it gave them the flexibility. Instead of taking the train down to a hotel by the shore, they could actually get in their car and rent out a summer cabin on the Cape. And there was more and more of this. You see the tourist map here is highlighting the fact that there are now paved roads on Cape Cod that your Model A's and Packards and things could use instead of grinding through the sand. At this time, the Chamber of Commerce, again, was ringing a bell saying, we want more people coming here, but we also want to make sure that we don't kill the golden goose, that we find ways to protect some of the important special places of the Cape. And a Chatham newspaper editor, Mr. Dunbar, he said basically that the Cape needed to preserve the back shore. It was a very special place. And that was, I think, the first indication to me that the call for a national seashore was being made. Here's an example of reuse of property. The Monomoy was used as a bombing range during World War II. And after that activity was ended, the federal government found a way to create a major first state national wildlife refuge out of the Monomoy Island at the east end of Nantucket Sound. In 1970, it was further preserved with a higher designation as a wilderness area, which has a higher degree of protection than a wildlife refuge. And this is the only one in Massachusetts that's been designated so far, indicating its importance as a coastal shorebird habitat. So again, people sounding the alarm. We need to preserve more of the Cape. 1959, Rachel Carson. It's a fascinating woman. In addition to writing Silent Spring, she was the first federal fisheries scientist that was female that was allowed to go out on the research vessels. And there's a statue now to her in Woods Hole. And she said, we must save the wilderness, the beach, and the dunes where Cape Cod is thrust into the Atlantic back towards the mainland. She was describing what's become the Cape Cod National Seashore. And sure enough, more people took up the call. A very interesting story. Tip O'Neill and his roommate, his Washington roommate, Eddie Bolin, they were both congressmen from Massachusetts. Eddie Bolin came back to Tip from a dedication of the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. And he said, Tip, we should do that on the Cape. And Tip said, okay, why don't you draft a bill? And so Eddie Bolin started the process of drafting the legislation that would become the National Seashore. Here you see smiling Jack Kennedy on the left and Massachusetts Republican Senator Saltonstall, Leverett Saltonstall. They worked together and had their staff, they tasked their staff with coming up with an innovative piece of legislation that would create a national seashore in and amongst towns that had been developing for almost 400 years. Not an easy thing to do. Remember, most national parks were out west, where the only thing that was being worked around was the tribal homelands and the great consternation of the tribes. But here in the east, it was much more difficult to think about that. But these two lawyers on Saltonstall's staff did much of the drafting of the bill, and they were Cape Codders, Jonathan Moore of Orleans, David Martin of Barnstable. I knew both of them, some more and some less, but they were instrumental in making sure that the national seashore could fit into Cape Cod. Jonathan Moore's quote here, we all can and must do our parts, meaning that it's not just the federal government that's going to save Cape Cod and its open space, but that people must rise up and take charge of their community if they want to preserve important natural areas. Here's our friend Henry David Thoreau again, and he's basically calling for the creation of town committees or nonprofit groups like land trusts that I work with to identify those special places in each town and to find a way to preserve them. This is Sampson's Island and Dead Neck and Cotuit and Osterville. These were important areas that were donated. Charles Bailey donated the Cotuit side, and Bunny Mellon donated the Osterville side. This is Bunny Mellon in the lower right here. She was a confidant of Jackie Kennedy's, and she actually designed the Rose Garden back when it was a rose garden. It's no longer a rose garden. It's a nice patio. So the towns did get into the act, and the state legislature adopted conservation commissions as a local body to identify these important areas to preserve. And in 1961, the first land gift directly to a town for conservation purposes, not for beach access or anything else, but to preserve wildlife habitat, was made in Brewster on Route 6A by Lucy Chapman there on the left. The importance of this 1967 effort in the town of Dennis, here you see Professor Norton Nickerson. He led a charge with other leaders of town, such as Kurt Livingston, to create the first package of open space to bring to town meeting and to vote on and to preserve, spending money that the town would have to raise through its taxes to buy. And important natural areas such as Crow's Pasture and Bass River were identified and purchased at that time. He was a Tufts professor, really instrumental in a lot of the environmental protection of the Cape. And the importance of the lady slippers here is that they were growing out on the edge of Bass River in the conservation area. And every spring he would lead a walk for people to go see the lady slippers in bloom and discuss them as a botany professor might. Interestingly, within 3 years of his death, all of the lady slippers winked out. And I think that they were sad that Norton was gone. So some of you have been here long enough to remember when the Cape led the state in its development. The development boom of the 1980s, the Cape basically increased by a third between 1980 and 1990 in population, and certainly in housing growth, large expansive subdivisions. You see here that there was a Boston Globe poll that found 75% of Cape Codders supported a ban or a moratorium on commercial and residential development. That is the sense of anxiety that led to increasing action by the towns and the townspeople to preserve open space before it was gone. And so during a big boom of the 1980s, towns went to town meeting and they voted to tax themselves and raise money to buy open space, $114 million to preserve 4,500 acres throughout the Cape. Every town was participating. And this was a phenomenon. Remember that there are many states at that time that weren't spending that kind of money on preserving open space. And here collectively, 15 towns were doing it in one county. The state government got into the act by purchasing large areas for public recreation, including Washburn Island and South Cape Beach, shown here, fronting on Nantucket Sound. And these are major areas that the state got into the act on, mostly through the Coastal Zone Management Office, as well as the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And then there was the rise of the land trusts in the 1980s. A lot of them got off the ground as volunteer nonprofit groups to work in conjunction with their town governments, but as an alternative, people who could work as volunteers, working privately, quietly with their landowner friends to figure out strategies to preserve open space. And I'm proud to say that the Compact of Cape Cod Conservation Trust, the group that I have worked with for 40 years now, is the oldest such regional network in the country, predating all these other alliances throughout the country. Ansel Chaplin was the founder, and he was an attorney in Truro, and he really had the vision to create this idea that we could all learn from each other, support each other. So it's not just Truro trying to preserve Truro, but Truro working with all the other towns to preserve what's important. I love this quote: "If it's money that talks to preserve open space on Cape Cod, then we'll find the money," he said. And he did. So since that time, we've grown from 6 organizations to 37. We're about to add our 38th next week, joining the Compact. These are all regional and local groups. They're not just land trusts, they're also watershed associations that understand the importance of preserving open space. Again, as we said, talking about the watershed lands, the best way to preserve the water, preserve the land in the watershed. So the phenomenon of open space preservation is not immune to national trends. As you may recall, we had a slight dip in the stock market in October 1987. And that led to not just a reduction in spending on open space, but kind of a lessening of the anxiety that we were not building as much because people couldn't get mortgages, but also just people feeling a little less secure in their own finances. So the towns stopped buying open space for a number of years. And it took, during that period, though, it was a great effort by a volunteer grassroots effort led by many civic and business leaders, politicians, to create a Cape Cod land bank. And the idea was to have a steady source of revenue that the towns could rely on to buy open space when it became available. And the legislature passed it, had to be ratified in each of the towns, and all of the towns ratified this amazing new legislation to add a 3% surcharge on property tax to be set aside simply for the purpose of preserving open space. And you'll see that the bluer the towns, those are the ones that supported it by the most, but all the towns supported this effort, and all our towns participated. We had 58% of the voters say, yes, we want to tax ourselves. This is important. We want to preserve open space. And so during the time of land bank, 1999 to 2007, we preserved another 4,500 acres of land, cost twice as much this time because real estate prices rarely go down on the Cape. And you'll see that almost half of the projects were partnerships between the local land trusts and their town governments. Oftentimes the land trust negotiating the deals, bringing them forward to the town for a blessing, and then town meeting funding through this land bank. In 2007, the land bank morphed into the Community Preservation Act. All of our towns have adopted that now as a way to fund not just open space, but also housing, historic preservation, and recreation. And that's been a successful effort as well. I want to talk a little bit about some of the beaches that were preserved along Nantucket Sound, because I think there's some interesting stories here. You may have heard of Marconi's wireless station, Wellfleet. He also had antenna in Chatham. And they were situated in the salt marsh behind Forest Beach on Nantucket Sound. And so this Radio Marine Corporation was a division of RCA, and they were basically broadcasting across the Atlantic to all the ships at sea. And it was a very important communication effort. But it was purchased and repurchased by different corporations. Eventually it ended up with something called WorldCom that was in partnership with MCI, the second largest telephone provider in the world at the time. They went bankrupt in 2002 due to some accounting shenanigans, and their CEO, Bernie Webbers, went to jail for it. But in order to raise money for the corporation, they sold Forest Beach to the town of Chatham for almost $1 million, as well as the old Marconi station on Route 28. And this was the first purchase by the land bank in Chatham. Having a ready source of revenue available enabled the town to spend the $1 million without having to go ask for new sources of revenue by the town. Coming into this century, we've known that the biggest piece of open space on the Cape is not the National Seashore. It's actually hanging out there in Upper Cape, Bourne, Sandwich, Falmouth, and Mashpee, the Camp Edwards, the military reservation. You see in red the Otis Air Force Base, now the Coast Guard station. But up in the 3/4 of the northern end of it was this amazing pine barrens, which is the top of the water supply for those 4 towns in the Upper Cape. It had no protection. It was being used for bombing and strafing and all the other type of military maneuvers. But the legislature dedicated it as a water supply, an important wildlife refuge. This was an amazing indication of the state's willingness to rededicate itself to open space preservation. There's still some limited training that goes on out there. So what's the result of all of this? Well, we did preserve more land. We've increased the Cape to almost 40% is open space. At the same time, we've developed 46%, and there's a small sliver that's left. The Cape is also known for having innovative approaches to open space protection. In 2012, the first native indigenous-led land trust east of the Mississippi was created in Mashpee by Wampanoag and Nipmuc people, and founded by Ramona Peters, second there on the right. And she had the vision that people would want to give land back if there was a native land trust created. And this group has now been around for 13 years. It's actually got a national presence. Have been able to help tribes in Alabama and Wisconsin to preserve land. Still headquartered in Mashpee with an office and a growing staff. I was pleased to be part of an effort by the Native Land Conservancy and the Dennis Conservation Land Trust in 2015 and renewed in 2021 to create a cultural respect easement. And this enables the Native Land Conservancy to have guaranteed access to all of the Dennis Land Trust properties to practice ceremony and cultural practices on these lands. It's basically welcoming people back to some of their ancestral homelands. This photo on the top is interesting because you can see here I am sitting in there as a notary public. We're ready to sign the easement and notarize it with the Dennis Land Trust people. And Ramona is signing the document on behalf of the Native Land Conservancy. But up above, you can see the eagle feathers being waved above the ceremony to keep the spirits at the highest level. It was just a great, powerful image to me of the Western way of doing things, signing papers, stamping them, and getting them to the registry of deeds, and the Native way of making sure that the vision of trust that's being engendered in the ceremony could continue. So we've had new partners working collaboratively, and this is not to be examined unless you want to go back and see the slide, but the idea was that having new partners, so we found ways to create partnerships with not just nonprofit groups and public entities, but also with for-profit groups. So this was an effort to preserve the shellfish hatchery in Dennis called ARC, Aquaculture Research Corp., to revive the hatchery, which provides shellfish seeds for all of the towns on the Cape, towns to going out and spreading them in the bays and having them grow out, but also to preserve the 40 acres of dunes and barrier beach behind the facility on Cape Cod Bay. And we raised $6 million, 3 of it privately, 3 of it through public sources, to do just that with all of these partners. That's the way things get done now with partners. I was most pleased to see the town of Brewster during the COVID pandemic out in the baseball outfield voting unanimously to spend $26 million they did not have, but would bond to create the biggest open space in town, Cape Cod Sea Camps, 55 acres on Cape Cod Bay with beach, and 70 acres on Long Pond, the largest pond on the Cape. So, did we save the Cape? No, we didn't save the Cape. It's become suburbanized to a great extent, and with its traffic and wastewater problems of many a Boston suburb. But I will say that I think we saved enough of the Cape. And by that, I mean, I think we've been able to save and preserve the Cape Cod experience, the ability to walk in the woods on an old cart path, the ability to still dig a clam on a shellfish bed that's been open, the ability to catch a striped bass from the shore. I mean, these are the Cape Cod experiences. It's the outdoors where people feel most at home on Cape Cod. And we still have places to do that. You have to find them. But if you're enterprising enough, you can do it. So just some statistics showing that the Cape has lost a lot of its forests, has become suburbanized, but again, there's still 14% of the land that can either be developed or preserved. And we don't need to preserve every acre, but we don't need to develop it either. We're going to find the most important pieces and preserve those. So for instance, our well fields, only about a third of them have been protected. There's still more to do to protect the land, again, the watershed around the wells that supply our drinking water supply. Now, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the vision I see for the future. And so there are several themes that we'll go over. One of them is undevelopment. Here you see an example in Barnstable, creating a nice little park on Parker's Pond in Osterville. And but the idea of undevelopment is simply to find some blighted areas, whether they're commercial developments, plywood motels on Route 28 or a popular one. Here's the oldest motel on Route 28 that was taken down bought and taken down by the town to create a beautiful sitting park overlooking the Mill Creek estuary that flows into Nantucket Sound through Lewis Bay. Nobody knew this view was here from Route 28 until we took down the Plywood Motel. Undevelopment has also been used to create new beaches on the Cape, and I think that we'll see more of this. As sea level rises, there'll be more places that are threatened with erosion and flooding. Those are opportunities, and here's two examples. This is in 1944. The hurricane took down the Dowse's mansion in Osterville, and instead of rebuilding it after the floodwaters receded, it was offered by the family to the town for $30,000 to create a residents-only beach, one of the few in Barnstable where it does not allow the out-of-towners to come in. You have to have a Barnstable Beach sticker and be a resident. So it's a beautiful example of taking back the Cape. So instead of being a private estate for one family, it's now one of the most beloved beaches in the town of Barnstable on Nantucket Sound. Also, on Vineyard Sound, we know Surf Drive in Falmouth is experiencing a lot of coastal erosion with the big tides that we get over the winter, not just necessarily hurricanes. But during Hurricane Bob, a lot of these beach cabanas that were built down low were wiped out, and some of them rebuilt on stilts, as they're allowed to do under regulations. But others were bought by the town using federal money, mitigation funds, to put the land back to its natural state and create new beachfront for the citizens. So here's a side-by-side example, the ones that rebuilt and the one that didn't, but created a new public beach space. So in terms of climate resilience, there are a lot of things that we can do, but primarily having a way to find ways that the shore can migrate. So salt marsh is going to be flooded and drowned unless we find coastal margins where it can migrate inland. Here's an example in Katuitt, Meadow Point, where, as you can see, sea level has risen and killed the cedars around the edge of the marsh. And we need a way to find a way to send the marsh into the trees. These areas that don't have bulkheads or seawalls where the salt marsh can migrate as sea level rises over time. We want to promote more agriculture, the little bit that we have left here on the Cape, the small farms that have important natural soils, good agricultural soils with good carbon content. Here's an example. There's a new group in Falmouth called Farming Falmouth, and they bought a 6-acre property, not just to preserve it for farming, but to preserve it for a farmer. Farmers need affordable housing. And so here's an example where a young farmer is installed in the farmhouse and working the fields out back and doing demonstrations and educational workshops so that other people can get into small-scale farming. We've also found alliances with watershed groups. In this example, the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition is working on restoring a commercial cranberry bog that had gone out of production and turning it back into a natural wetland. The idea is to attenuate the nitrogen coming out of septic systems from the residential subdivisions nearby, as well as to improve the flow of water for the herring run that runs through the edge of the bogs. And so this monoculture of cranberries, because they're not producing enough profit nowadays, a lot of them are going out of business. And the idea is to restore them to a natural flowing wetland, such as this one at Coonamessett. There are several in Harwich, working on one, the hospital bogs in Yarmouth, and there'll be others coming forward soon. This is a great, inspiring example of taking back the Cape that we all should be applauding. We work with partners such as watershed groups. Here's the biggest watershed group I know of, covering all of Nantucket Sound. The Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound is trying to preserve the largest open space, 750 square miles. Another new partner is the working with affordable housing groups. And so we do this in a deliberate, thoughtful way. Here's an example in North Falmouth, where a 57-acre property, we're going to carve off 7 acres where the old house was to create a small Habitat for Humanity subdivision up on the corner. We'll keep the forest intact for its habitat qualities, but enable 14 families to move in to small houses. So, again, our friend Henry David Thoreau, he's talking about the Cape. He said, the coast will never be more attractive than it is now on the Cape. Again, I think the people having this foreboding sense that the goose would lay the golden egg was going to be killed unless we did something to preserve some of it. And that's what this is all about. People working together to preserve the land. Henry Beadle Huff on the Vineyard founded the oldest land trust on the Cape and Islands, 1959, Sheriff's Meadow Foundation. When Cape Pogue was preserved, he said, does anyone ask, what is it good for? It doesn't have to be good for something. It is good. And I think that's the way that I and a lot of people feel that the open space shouldn't have to justify itself. It doesn't have to be useful. It is good. And that's the thing that's important. One of the themes that we have to remember is that it's going to take a lot of effort to defend the properties that we have preserved in the last century, because people will always see it as a place that they can play out their other social needs, whether it's housing or cemeteries or schools, all the things that towns need. They're going to be trying to raid our open spaces, and we have to learn to not just protect them with legal means, but with political will. People going to town meetings saying, thou shalt not take this land out of conservation. Just this past couple of weeks, the town of Falmouth went to town meeting and voted to rededicate the land around its water supply at Long Pond to the Conservation Commission because there had been some discrepancies in the way the deeds had been coming in over the past 100 years. And that's an example of retaining the open space, that making it clear to everybody that you're not going to put the new police station out there. That's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll just end by saying that those two young guys running across the bog are now 28 and 30. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. Really interesting history. I enjoyed that very much. I'm sure our audience did as well. I have a few questions for you. First one is, if you had to point to one decision or trend in the next 10 years that would determine the future of conservation on the Cape, what is it?
Well, I think it's, I talked about climate change and resilience in the landscape, and I think that that's it's probably the most important thing, because how we respond to sea level rise on our shores, we're seeing more blights in our forests. The pine blights, the beech, the beech leaf disease. We're seeing a lot of new diseases that are coming up from down south or from other places away that are threatening the forests. And these are being exacerbated by climate change because the Cape doesn't have the brutally cold winters that we used to have. Remember now, a lot of times our ticks were killed off by the killing frosts of the winter. We haven't had that in the last several years. I mean, we have basically ticks in the landscape all year round now. I've certainly been a victim of that myself. But I think the main response to climate resilience is to preserve more land, to give nature a way to respond and react to these new stresses upon it by the climate change. And I've been told by ecologists that, when I say as a land trust, what's the local land trust to do to work on climate change? And their answer unanimously is preserve more land, because that's the place where nature needs to be able to respond. It's not going to be able to respond as well in our neighborhoods, in our manicured lawns, and our parking lots.
Okay, makes sense. All right, with respect to Nantucket Sound, what are the most urgent threats to beachfront and bayshore areas today?
Well, you know better than I. Certainly erosion resulting from rising sea level, bigger storms, more frequent storms, but also the water quality. And, this idea of sewering everything is going to be impossible. We're going to have to find ways to mitigate the water pollution coming in from the septic systems. And so sewering is one part, alternative septic systems is another. smaller package treatment plants. Excuse me. My lights just went off here. They're on a timer. Anyway, that's a good way to end the session, isn't it?
I've got one or two more questions for you before
Okay,
we
go ahead.
disappear. Okay, how does land conservation directly impact the health of the sound? What's the connection people might miss?
Right. And so again, preserving the land around the watershed, as I said, is the most important way to do that. Um, you know, the sound is a sink. It's receiving all the waters coming in from the estuaries. So whether it's the shallow, narrow streams like the Coonamessett River or the Bass River, uh, those are the conduits. So that if those estuaries are polluted, the sound is the nearshore waters of the sound are going to be polluted, and we've seen increasing signs of eutrophication and loss of eelgrass beds in the nearshore areas of Nantucket Sound. So cleaning up our act on the land is going to necessarily give us a leg up on preserving the sound.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Tom that says, one of your slides describes salt intrusion that killed cedars, and you said something about bringing the marsh into the trees. Could you say more about that, the challenge of the process, and what problems it might solve?
Right. So it has to do with the grade of the floodplain next to the salt marsh. If it's too steep, there's not much lateral area where the salt marsh can migrate to. If it's flatter, there's more chance for the rising sea level to bring the salt marsh grass seeds floating in on the higher tides and finding an anchor. As those cedars and other trees die down and become stumps like the ones you saw on the slide, there'll be more open areas for the salt marsh, hopefully, to gain a foothold. It's going to take a long time. It may not be successful. We may lose a lot of our salt marshes because the sea level rise is happening so quickly. We're not sure that the salt marshes can keep up with it. But we're going to give it a shot. And so that less armoring on our shore, I think, is important. Giving the salt marsh a chance. If it hits a seawall, it's not going to be able to go anywhere. So,
Okay. Um, okay, sorry. Peter's asking that you expand a bit more on the 14% of the land that's neither developed or protected. And is it vulnerable? Is in danger? Where is that land?
right. So we've done some really extensive mapping of the important resource areas on the Cape, including that 14% that's neither yet developed nor preserved. It's up for grabs. Uh, Approximately 80% of the 14% is in a critical resource area. It's been identified by the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. And so we know where those lands are. We just have to find a way to negotiate to buy them.
Okay. Um, and the last question I have is for somebody watching tonight who cares deeply about the Cape but isn't yet involved, what's the most meaningful action they can take? What can people do?
Well, become involved. Join your local land trust. My organization's website has links to all of them, the compact.net. And so you can click on the links to the land trust in your community, become a member, become involved. They're always looking for volunteers. Um, Getting involved in town politics. We don't see enough people involved in town politics now as I think we used to. And of course, people are busy, but if you don't take charge at the local level, nothing's going to get done.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Really enjoyed the presentation, and I hope the audience did too. We have a couple of webinars coming up in the next few months. In June, we have Coastal Treasures, Seashells and the Stories They Tell with shellfish biologist and author Sandy McFarlane. That's June 4th. And then on Thursday, July 30th, we have the Cranberry Bog Project, Restoring Nature's Coastal Landscape, that Mark alluded to that, with Karen Beatty from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. So, visit our website if you want to sign up. If you have any questions for me or have questions for Mark, I can, ask him for you or directly or direct you to him. But my email is audra@saveoursound.org. And I hope you learned a lot tonight. I hope Mark expanded on just another reason why open space protection, whether it's on land or on water, is important and that you support both our organizations. So thanks so much. Thanks, Mark, and have a good evening.
Thank you.